Valentina and Gisela for interpreting today's meeting. And Joel, it looks like we have the recording ready to go as well as the Spanish recording, right? Great, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. I know that our co-chairs, Ian and Tyson, both reached out to us and said that they might be running just a few minutes late. And so we will go ahead and get started without them. First and foremost, I wanted to do a tribal land acknowledgement. And so as we welcome everyone today to today's meeting, I want to just pause and acknowledge that what is now Colorado includes the land of the Ute, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Dene, Lakota, Apache, Pueblo nations, and many tribes, and that the sovereign tribal governments of the Ute, Mountain Ute, and the Southern Ute Indian tribes will still reside in the state. These tribes are the original stewards of these natural areas, and we want to take a moment to honor and respect these original stewards of the environment and their relationship with this land. With that said, I would like to kind of get a head count here and see who all is in the room. So I will go ahead and lead us through a roll call. And I will start off with Robin. So if you could just come off mute or like give me a thumbs up or something. Robin.
Hi, I'm here.
Hello. Trisha.
Hi, I'm here.
Sheila.
I'm here.
Elizabeth Scoder.
Hi, I'm here.
Marcia Nelson, and Marcia did mention that she might be in and out a bit. Dominique. Doug Dean. Oh, Dominique, are you here?
Oh, sorry, I thought you said her name. I apologize.
Oh, it's all good. Doug.
I'm here.
Great. Jonathan.
Present.
Great. Jordan. Hilda.
Here.
Mara.
Good afternoon.
Ian. We're still waiting on Ian. Renee. I think I heard Renee earlier, yes.
Now I.
Kimberly.
Here.
Okay. Michael Sapp.
Present.
And I think we're still waiting on Tyson. Beatriz. And Beatriz did say she would be a few minutes late. Mira.
Here.
Gary.
Good afternoon.
Jamie.
I'm here.
Okay, and Arthur. And very lastly, Uni. Okay, so we are missing a few folks, but that's okay. We can go ahead and get started. So once again, for our members of the public that are joining, we did kind of full-blown introductions at the first and second EJ Action Task Force meetings, and to just maximize our time here, we're gonna kind of skip the in-depth introductions, and Joel will drop a link in the chat, which is to our recording for the first meeting. And if you watch the very beginning of that recording, you can get a little bit more acquainted with the folks that are on this call. Okay, so as you all know, and we just met on Tuesday, and we've been talking about how can we, after all of these meetings and subcommittee meetings, start to get moving towards the recommendations that the EJ Action Task Force is tasked with. And so as your staff, the EJ unit has created a document by reviewing recordings and the notes for each of the prior task force meetings and subcommittee meetings. This did end up taking a very long time, which is why, and apologies that the draft that we sent you did go out around 5 o'clock yesterday. We don't expect that folks have read it, but if any of you had given it a scan, or if you would like to, kind of just skim through it now as I get us grounded, that would be more than welcome. I will just say that we are going to do a screen share and share out on the document in full that way. So the way we've done it is we've compiled all the questions and ideas that are relevant to the topics that the task force has identified that they want to address. And this is the first time we've distilled all of that information down in one place. The document is organized by subcommittee right now, but we don't need to keep that organized that way. We can change the structure, you know, in all of that feedback, not only in terms of content, but how you all want it organized is all welcome today. And keep in mind that although we have created this document as your staff and we're the ones that distilled down the information, none of these ideas are our own. They're ideas that came from all of you as task force members, and you know, ideas and suggestions that were recorded in notes. I want to just emphasize that this document is a starting point. I do not want to spend much time today wordsmithing anything. It's really kind of looking over questions, like seeing if we're asking the right questions in terms of like recommendation topics that are proposed. You know, how are we feeling about those? Kind of really looking at high level topics right now. This is really meant to like guide and structure the discussion for this task force and its subcommittees as we work towards the preliminary draft, which we had decided would be in June. So again, this is like, you know, pre-draft. You know, I think I've labeled it as a draft, but we're not even quite there yet. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the document to provide more details and overview now. And I'm going to go through the whole document, as I mentioned. And I think it would be great if I'll kind of go through the entire thing. If there are any like ideas or notes that are popping up for you, maybe kind of jot those down on your own and save them towards the very end. I do want to just make sure that we get through the full document. It's about 10 pages long, but I do kind of want to walk through it in its entirety. There are questions that might bubble up for you that end up getting answered as we kind of move through it. If there is anything like super pressing, like you can't hear me well, or there's just something like glaringly that you're like, please stop, just come off mute or give me a quick hand raise. And yeah, I mean, I think I want to make sure that we are, as I go through the document, you know, I know that me kind of reading this aloud may not be the most engaging way to do it, but I just want to make sure that folks have the time now during this dedicated space for the meeting to kind of see all of the content and we can look at it together. So, you know, please do actively listen, you know, take notes on your own. And then I do hope for a really robust discussion once we get to that portion. Any questions or comments before we get started? And I'll do a screen share in just a moment here. All right, not hearing any, so let's get started. Okay. All right, can everyone see my screen okay? Great, thank you. All right, does sizing look okay? Does anybody want me to make it larger? Does it seem all right? Head nods, thumbs up.
Perfect.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's go through this. So these are the ideas of the EJ Action Task Force, and keep in mind that this document really summarizes the questions and ideas that you all have come up with and raised during prior task force meetings, during subcommittee meetings, in that we as your staff have created this. We've compiled questions, ideas that are relevant to the task force, And as I mentioned, the document is organized by subcommittees, does not necessarily need to stay that way. This document is meant to be a starting point for future conversations. The questions and potential recommendations are meant for additional discussion. And we're hoping that this will be the starting point for the draft that we come up with in June. All right, some things to keep in mind while we review this, and these are notes from our Tuesday's meeting. These were things that you all had mentioned as kind of expectations from us as EJ unit staff, kind of creating this, and expectations that you all had for yourselves in the discussion today. So one, pointing out reoccurring recommendation topics. So as we went through all of the notes, we were really looking at, okay, where are the reoccurring themes? Where are things constantly popping up? Recurring questions that may remain unanswered or that we need to develop a plan of action to address. Ensuring that recommendations focus on implementation and using existing systems and processes, if possible, to ensure that the recommendations are achieved. And if those systems and processes are not in place, then highlighting those as topics where recommendations could be made. We also wanted to highlight recommendation topics listed in the EJ Act that haven't been addressed yet. And lastly, really focusing on the audience for recommendations. So who would make the change? Is it the legislature? Is it, a specific agency? Should what we are recommending apply to all agencies? So kind of high level overview of kind of the mindset that we went into creating this with. And I will just note that while I could read this really fast, I am going to kind of keep a slower pace for our interpreters. High level questions that have just popped up. How can we ensure that the task force recommendations themselves are accessible to the community? So, thinking about language, thinking about, how we are describing things, making sure that they're not too complex or technical. How can we focus on existing processes within the government where we can recommend changes to make the recommendations more implementable? So, things that already exist. If instead of like reinventing the wheel, what are things that are already in place? And then high level considerations. These recommendations need to be directed to the legislature, governor, or CDPHE. And keep in mind that we can also include the EJ Advisory Board. They will be the ones distributing the grant funding for the environmental justice, the EJ mitigation grants. And so the EJ Advisory Board is kind of couched under CDPHE, so recommendations can be directed to them as well. Robin.
Hi, thanks, Lebna. I appreciate this document. It's super helpful to get at what I think a bunch of folks were talking about earlier this week, which is a sense of where are we? On this particular bullet point that you just read, well, first I should say, is it okay to ask questions? I'm not going to offer thoughts, right? I know we're going to discuss when you're as directed as you lead us, but I have a question. Is that okay to ask now?
Yeah, of course.
So recommendations to the legislature, the governor, or CDPHE, is that it? So that doesn't include I'm on the definition of DI community subcommittee, and maybe we want to talk to OGCC and suggest they update their definition to look more like ours, or vice versa. You know what I'm saying? So is other agencies out of the scope of recommendations?
No, definitely not. We can provide recommendations, and again, I guess keeping in mind that who these recommendations are going to be reviewed by. So if we provide recommendations for a different agency or a commission in another agency, the legislature, the governor, CDPHE will be the ones reviewing those, and then we can kind of share that information and pass it along. So just kind of keeping in mind the way the EJ Act is written and who the ultimate document will be for. But the world of who we want to involve and what we want to recommend is very vast.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other questions before I get into the first set of recommendations? Hi, Ian. Welcome. Okay, so again, this is arranged by subcommittees. This is in no particular order. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the data and health disparities. So in each section, we've included the language directly from the statute so that we know kind of what is the language in the statute, one, that helped form that subcommittee, but two, kind of what we should continue to focus on as we are talking about data. So the language in the EJ Act is that recommendations for establishing measurable goals for reducing environmental health and health disparities for disproportionately impacted communities can be made. We can include the adoption of a plan that addresses the lack of data and lack of data sharing between state agencies about potential exposure to environmental hazards, and improves research and data collection efforts related to the health and environment of disproportionately impacted communities, climate change, and the inequitable distribution of burdens and benefits of the management and use of natural resources. Okay, so recurring questions that have come up in the Data and Health Disparities Subcommittee. What is the universe of data that exists within state agencies, including CDPHE? What kind of data is needed or required to advance EJ? And we need this before we can address data gaps, right? And some examples are indicators relevant to cumulative impacts. Should our inventory of current data tools be specific to Colorado? Or should we also consider national data sets? Should we focus on identifying data sets that allow us to identify cumulative impacts? How can data be collected in a way that is useful for the questions we want to answer? How can data supplement, validate lived experience? So kind of getting into that qualitative piece. How can we incorporate community stories into data? How can we make the data we have that links health impacts to environmental exposures more accessible to communities? How can we use community science to bridge gaps between agencies and communities in the data collection process? How do we incorporate social determinants of health, like lack of access to green spaces, that we know impact community health? Do we need two groups of data, one for researchers and then a separate one for the public? What is the best way to present data to make it accessible to DI, disproportionately impacted communities? And how do we develop recommendations around risk communication? So these are themes that kind of kept popping up and questions that were formed. As we get into some of these recommendation topics, I also want to mention that some of these are the views or opinions of one or two task force members. So they don't necessarily represent, there might be questions or recommendations that pop up here that you're like, I'm not on board with this. This is not what I think. And that is totally fine. This is, again, the whole collection of what all of the task force members are thinking. Considerations to discuss further to develop recommendations. So the data that the community needs is often different than the data that the state needs to identify disproportionately impacted communities. Big data gaps related to occupational health exposures, as well as indoor air quality, such as gas burning stoves, household products, et cetera, and cumulative impacts. So there's big data gaps between those like health exposures and indoor air quality, but then tying that in with everything else, with all the other exposures that exist. Lack of data collection in mobile home parks. The need to incorporate a sensitivity analysis to understand what is driving the score we are seeing in EnviroScreen. And data gaps. And so these are some areas that have been identified for data gaps. So uncollected data, for example, there's no metric on stress or no metric on outdoor recreation. There's issues with having to pay for data, proprietary data. There's issues with data accessibility and issues with data accuracy. And another thing for consideration is UNI's framework, which helps us to categorize the lack of data and data sharing. And UNI presented this framework at the last data subcommittee meeting, and we'll continue to use it as a framework for the upcoming meetings. Potential recommendations. So we need to shift from deficit framing, essentially blaming the people most impacted by EJ issues, to asset framing, identifying the strengths and aspirations of a community. And there's a link to asset framing. This is a resource that Dr. Sheila Davis has shared with us, and I think something that would be really valuable for folks to review. We need to weave the utility of Colorado EnviroScreen into some of our recommendations, asking representatives from community organizations what data sets are most helpful for them as they advocate for EJ and health equity issues. Utilizing community scientists, sometimes called citizen science, to bridge the gap that census data is not collecting. So for example, undocumented folks may not fill out the census, and so we're not capturing data on them. Focusing on rural populations, which have some of the highest EJ screen tools. If you look at like EnviroScreen, a lot of our populations are focused in rural areas. And so how can we do that further? Measurable goals for eliminating health disparities, which should be informed by community. So the granularity of data, what is most useful, and should it be informed by the community? So for example, county level data versus census tract level data. Determining what data would be most useful to collect. Expanding the Colorado oil and gas health and information response beyond oil and gas. And so thinking about other areas like transportation. Expanding the use of promotoras and community liaisons to distribute existing community health resources. Utilizing existing resources from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we saw, mobile vaccination clinics and buses. How can we maximize those resources and continue to use those to collect data on community lived experience and recommend a new investigation program around this? Environmental divisions with CDPHE need to communicate with health divisions in toxicology, such as toxicology and environmental epidemiology, on their data collection methods to answer questions related to both environment and health. Sometimes we see a divide there. While it is a great asset that the Colorado Department of Health and Environment is both health and environment, sometimes we see a disconnect there. There's not always overlap. And then we must start with systems of repression to identify data bias and reduce environmental health disparities. I won't read through these. This is just an inventory of tools that have been identified during the data subcommittee meetings. I did forget to hyperlink this EnviroScreen, but we can get that done in a second. But you can see here, these are all hyperlinked to resources of data that, either our task force members or folks during public comment have shared as resources that would be useful. All right, I just want to pause for a second for Valentina and Gisela. Is pace okay for you all as interpreters? Great. Okay, so powering through, appreciate the undivided attention from you all. I know that this is not the most engaging way to do this, but I'm hoping that we can kind of comb through this and talk about it together. So best practices for community engagement. The language from the EJ Act is that the goal of outreach to an engagement of disproportionately impacted communities is to build trust and transparency, provide meaningful opportunities to influence public policy, and modify proposed state action in response to received public input to decrease environmental burdens or increase environmental benefits for each disproportionately impacted community. Starting off with engagement, to promote the goal of state engagement in disproportionately impacted communities, an agency shall strive to create new ways to gather input from communities across the state, using multiple languages, multiple formats, and transparency sharing information about adverse environmental effects from its proposed state action. The agencies shall schedule variable times of day and days of the week for opportunities for public input on the proposed state action, including at least one weekend time, one evening time, and one morning time for public input. Keep in mind, these are things that are already in the EJ Act that we are using as best practices. So as we're kind of in this space for the subcommittee, we're thinking about how we can go above and beyond what's already written here. Providing a notice at least 30 days before any public input opportunity or before the start of any public comment period. Utilizing several different methods of outreach and ways to publicize the proposed state action, including disseminating information through schools, clinics, social media, social and activity clubs, local governments, tribal governments, libraries, religious organizations, civic associations, community-based and environmental justice organizations, or other local services. Provide several methods for the public to give input, such as in-person meetings, virtual and online meetings, online comment portals or email, and call-in meetings. Consider using a variety of locations for public input on the proposed state action, including meeting locations in urban centers, in neighborhoods whose populations are predominantly Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and have an average income below the state's average, and in rural locations in various regions of the state. And lastly, creating outreach materials concerning the proposed state action in layperson's terms, translated in the top 2 languages spoken in a community that inform people of opportunities to provide input on the proposed state action, their rights, the possible outcomes, and the upcoming public input process. So this is what we already have as best practices in the EJ Act. So in this space, in this subcommittee, what are reoccurring questions that are bubbling up? What does meaningful engagement really even mean? Can we kind of come together and define this as a task force? How do we address the fact that meaningful engagement will look different for each community? How can we measure success around engagement? How do we measure or document relationship building, trust, intentionality? How do we shift from counting who shows up to meetings to measuring and illustrating how the agency responds in a manner that reduces harm and strengthens environmental justice? So high-level recommendation topics: funds should be built into all budgets for outreach and engagement, and agencies should hire dedicated personnel to focus on this to address capacity concerns. We hear all too often that, oh, we would have done this if we had, the personnel, if we had the capacity. So there should be funds dedicated specifically to that. Timing of meeting choosing 2 meeting times instead of 3 different meeting times to reduce meeting fatigue amongst community members. While there were 3 different meeting times proposed in the EJ Act, sometimes this can kind of spread the community a little too thin. So maybe we focus on 2 meeting times that are variable times. Considering using the following types of outreach methods not currently listed in the statute. And here are some new outreach methods that are not mentioned. Keep in mind that we might not have these explicitly written out in the EJ Act, but these were ideas that were specifically mentioned during the best practices for community engagement subcommittee meeting. And I'll pause, and Robin, go ahead.
Hi, sorry. For those of you who know me, there will be no surprise that I have a billion questions. At any time, please feel free to tell me to save them until the end. I'm just wondering for these recommendations, and I'm really, really interested in these because we are trying so hard to do better at this, and like sometimes feeling, like we're not doing as good of a job as we need to be. And like, this is really critical for us to learn to do better. I'm just, as far as it pertains to recommendations, like, so for example, where the Environmental Justice Act requires us to do a meeting, during the business day and then the evening and then the weekend, or like the morning, the evening, and the weekend, this recommendation is this something that's more like, this is just a best practice, or are we talking about potential changes to the Environmental Justice Act, or like, unclear. You know, because I think we've run into the problem that the folks we want to talk to have meeting fatigue as well, but you know, the Environmental Justice Act says what it says. So this could include like going back and revisiting those provisions as well, right?
Yeah, that's right, Robin. You know, I think as the task force, I think you all should kind of think about the world of, you know, the change that you can make. For example, there is a definition of disproportionately impacted community in the EJ Act, but that is meant to be discussed, you know, changed. It's fluid, and so keeping in mind, while there are recommendations that are already built into the EJ Act, these are recommendations that can change.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so some of the outreach methods that were mentioned were radio advertisements, community connectors in each community. We should ensure that we use preferred outreach locations, and this is a suggestion that came from a public comment, but you know, ensuring that we're working with people in the community to find the best methods of outreach. You know, sometimes we come in and we might put things in a certain location thinking that that's a good way to disseminate information, but it might not be a trustworthy source or a place that the community is comfortable engaging with. And allow community members to be the ones broadcasting meeting announcements and creating opportunities for people to engage. Utilizing promotoras to train community members to be the ones doing outreach and engagement, phone banking, handing out flyers and posting on local bulletin boards. Consider providing additional methods for public input not currently listed in the statute. And so this is kind of alluded to, but there was you know, recommendation that we definitely stick to hybrid meetings. Even if a meeting is in person, ensuring that there is always an option to attend virtually, especially since we have such a strong infrastructure for this now with Zoom in the age of COVID. Considering using the following when selecting in-person meeting locations: free parking, choosing a safe location, having access to public transportation, near bike paths, choosing locations where local businesses can economically benefit from the meeting. For outreach materials, creating an outreach plan, using plain language, making materials highly visible, making materials including meeting notice available in the top 3 spoken languages in an area, and other services. So consider using innovative alternatives like Lyft vouchers or bus passes to help people get to an in-person meeting. Providing childcare or adequate compensation for childcare so that people can, you know, make sure that their kids are attended to while they can participate in a meeting. And providing COVID test kits for those who register for in-person attendance to ensure that we are all being safe. Paying contractors or local organizations to do focus groups in their own community on best practices for community engagement rather than having an outside contractor kind of coming in and talking with the community. State agencies should partner with local organizations to gain authentic community input and ensure that input provided by communities gets back to them through later explanations of how their ideas were heard or acted upon. Sometimes, you know, especially with commissions, we often get this like one-way communication. So how are we acknowledging or, you know, making it known to the community that, hey, we heard your ideas, and going from there. I do want to pause for a second. We just got through 2 sections. We have a few more coming up. How are folks feeling about kind of going through the rest of this document? Is this helpful? Is it helpful to kind of walk through it, or does this feel like overkill? Are you like, please God, like, let me just read this document on my own? And I welcome feedback at this time. Okay.
I'm finding it helpful.
All right, maybe we do a quick vote. That might be the best way to do this. So for folks that want to kind of, we're starting on page 6. This document is 10 pages long. So it's actually 9.5 pages long. So we have about 4 to 5 pages left to go. Do we want to continue doing this? And if so, please give me a thumbs up. And I will not be offended if you do not want to do this. Okay, I counted 7 people in favor, 8. And folks that do not want to move forward, I recognize that some people might be like multitasking and not at their computer to give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. So thumbs down if you do not want to proceed in this way and want to kind of jump into this discussion and have a chance to read this document on your own. So thumbs down from our task force members if you do not want to continue with reading the document.
We may not actually have the thumbs down emoji enabled in this Zoom for non-hosts of the meeting. So,
Oh,
but
okay.
it did count at least, I think 4 task force members suggested that they would prefer to not continue in this way, at least in the chat.
Okay. All right. I'm seeing more people saying that they want to move forward than not. And yes, I'm looking through the chat now. All right. Well, we will move forward. I think that the majority of folks would like to just kind of skim through the document. So we'll go through, and I will try to go through without quickening my pace too much for the interpreters. Valentina, Gisela, if I pick up my speed too fast, just give me a thumbs up in this case to just let me know. Okay, so Indigenous community engagement. This was the very last subcommittee that was formed. Not a whole lot here because we've only met once, but reoccurring questions and really important considerations. How can we ensure that tribal governments have an opportunity to provide input on the recommendations of the task force in a manner that works for them and respects their sovereignty? How can we best engage Indigenous people living in urban areas as part of our broader work on community engagement? And should areas under tribal jurisdiction be classified as disproportionately impacted communities? And if so, under what prongs of the definition? Potential recommendations: provide funding resources to tribal governments. All state agencies should have tribal liaisons, and the names of power plants named after tribes, for example, the Cherokee power plant, should be changed. All right, so moving on to the definition of DI community. I just want to be mindful of the folks that said that they do not enjoy hearing this read out to them. Feel free to put your computer on mute and go through the document yourself over the next few minutes. And you'll see that I'll kind of stop the screen share for a few minutes when we're ready to get into the discussion. Everybody has this document in their email. And Joel, if you'd like to, you can, I think you've already dropped it in the chat, but just to have it pop up now. But you can kind of scroll through that. And when we get to the discussion portion, I'm not going to do a screen share. That way we can all see each other and kind of engage in a more meaningful way. Okay, so for the definition of DI community, I am going to skip over the language in the EJ Act because we have gone over it so many times in our subcommittee meetings, in our task force meetings. Feel free to kind of skim through that, and I'll just jump right into the recurring questions. So how should the definition of disproportionately impacted community take into account the lack of reliability of census data? And should the definition take this into account? How can we map or clearly identify communities with a history of environmental racism, redlining, and other exclusionary zoning laws? How do we take into account communities that were redlined, but that no longer meet the current definition of a disproportionately impacted community due to gentrification? Should a history of environmental racism be considered in other ways? So for example, in an equity analysis and community engagement, be considered in other ways, but then not incorporated into the definition of disproportionately impacted communities where action and priorities are currently placed. So, ensuring that we're we're focusing on these populations, but maybe they're not written into the definition. Which agencies should the definition of disproportionately impacted community apply to? Are there other agencies outside of the Air Quality Control Commission within CDPHE that it should apply to? Should the same definition apply to all state agencies, or should there be different definitions amongst different state agencies because they use the definitions for different purposes? Should we suggest that the definition may change over time? What threshold should be used within EnviroScreen? So for example, a percentile score to identify disproportionately impacted communities under the cumulative impacts prong. What is the most effective way to make EnviroScreen available to the public? Is the census block group level the right level to define DI communities? Is it too large? Is it too small? How will we consider small, disproportionately impacted communities located within larger areas that otherwise do not meet the definition? Should all disproportionately impacted communities be treated equally, or should there be different requirements for them based on the reason why they are identified as disproportionately impacted? Are the demographic thresholds, so in this case, what's written into the EJ Act, 40% race, related to race, 40% low income, and 40% housing cost burden, are those set at appropriate levels? Is housing cost burden the best demographic indicator, or should other definitions be considered, such as linguistic isolation, a proxy for English language proficiency? And then potential recommendations. And these are short because we have had a lot of questions in the subcommittee. And so we need to kind of get to a place where we're moving into the recommendation phase. Potential recommendation topics, generally that have been made is that we should change the term minority in the definition to people of color and provide a clear definition of what that means. And we should use Colorado EnviroScreen to identify disproportionately impacted communities. Not the only tool necessarily, but that we should use that as a tool. Okay, and then lastly, this is, not lastly, second to last, this is the supplemental environmental project section. This was recently introduced to you all on Tuesday. And so as you'll remember in the statute, there is the possibility to provide a potential requirement that all environmental projects developed as part of a settlement relating to violations in a disproportionately impacted community are developed in consultation with and through meaningful participation of individuals in the disproportionately impacted community and result in improvement to the health and environment of the affected community. Recurring questions from just our discussion on Tuesday. Can community members be involved with determining the size of the grant that will be distributed? How can we make supplemental environmental projects accessible to smaller organizations that don't have a history of doing large projects? How can community members engage early in an enforcement process where an SEP is contemplated while maintaining appropriate confidentiality? Other questions that came up, where is penalty revenue for enforcement actions going now? Is it already being directed back to the communities in another way? Can supplemental environmental projects request for applications be narrowed so the funds are only used for projects within a DI community where a violation occurred? What about penalties for violations in areas adjacent to DI communities? Does the size of the penalty matter for community-based supplemental environmental projects? How should we address supplemental environmental projects for multiple violations over a larger geographic area that includes some, but not entirely all, disproportionately impacted communities? Can we quantify the harm caused by the violation that led to the enforcement action and tailor the project to remedy that specific harm? So all great questions. And then recommendations that bubbled up during Tuesday's meeting. If the entity that is the subject of the enforcement action participates in a selection committee with community members, it should have a non-voting role. Clearly explain conflict of interest requirements and other procedural aspects to community members participating in the supplemental environmental project selection committees at the outset. Revisit conflict of interest requirements to avoid unintended barriers and more clearly communicate these requirements to community members, again, at the outset. Simplify supplemental environmental project applications to make them more accessible to small community groups with limited staff capacity or English skills. Revisit confidentiality requirements to ensure they are not unduly restrictive. So there's like actually looking at the requirement itself, should that be changed? And then lastly, enforcement penalty revenue should go back to the disproportionately impacted community where the violation occurred through a supplemental environmental project or another means. And then potentially providing recommendations to the advisory board, which distributes the air pollution control division's penalty revenue, as well as to CDPHE's supplemental environmental program. So providing recommendations to both of those bodies. All right. Lastly, we have environmental equity and cumulative impacts analysis. Again, the statute language here is pretty lengthy, and so I won't review this just for the sake of not boring you all, but I will highlight the recurring questions. So, who is the equity analysis for? Who do we want to use the equity analysis? Should it be used by legislators or by state agencies, potentially by both? Which state agencies besides CDPHE should conduct equity analyses? Who all should an equity analysis benefit? Should we create different categories or tiers for the equity analysis? How should decision-making take an equity analysis into account? What exactly should an equity analysis, when exactly should an equity analysis occur? Should the definition of state action expand beyond rulemaking, permitting, and enforcement? Should equity analyses be required for both rulemaking and permitting? Should we consider different equity analysis frameworks for different state agencies and different types of state action? Should this task force come up with its own definition for cumulative impacts for Colorado? Should environmental screening tools such as EnviroScreen be used to make decisions about where the government invests its resources? Should an equity analysis take place incrementally at different stages of decision making? So for example, at modeling, at permitting, at monitoring, and at enforcement. Does an equity or cumulative impacts analysis look different for urban versus rural populations? And how will we address cumulative impacts and how does that relate to disproportionately impacted communities? And finally, the home stretch here, the potential recommendations coming out of the equity analysis subcommittee. Environmental equity analysis should benefit DI communities. We should ensure that the agency staff, boards, and commissions empowered to make decisions are able to use and do use equity analyses to inform their decisions. There should be a feedback loop. Equity analysis should inform the community, and then community should inform the analysis itself. Benefits to the disproportionately impacted communities should be incorporated into an equity analysis, for example, workforce development. There should be qualitative, trauma-sensitive data that should be incorporated into a cumulative impacts analysis, and an equity analysis should be done at the modeling stage prior to permitting with the input of the community. And then lastly, these are just some high-level outstanding questions from the EJ Act that need further consideration. This is kind of touching on the point here where we were like, okay, we've kind of categorized this EJ Act language into different subcommittees that you've seen, but this is a list of topics in the EJ Act for the task force to consider that are not really thoroughly addressed in the reoccurring questions and potential recommendations from the subcommittees listed above. So those considerations are cumulative impacts, whether an equity analysis should include an analysis of cumulative impacts. We haven't really kind of talked about those things in tandem very much. We talk about equity analysis and then we talk about cumulative impacts. and we haven't really touched on the cumulative impacts piece too much. And then how this type of cumulative impacts analysis should be conducted. And then outcome of an equity analysis, should the equity analysis for permits include an analysis of how to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts that are identified? This is language directly from the EJ Act. And should there be a requirement to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts for equity analyses in general, beyond permitting decisions? All right, so that takes us to the end. About 9.5 pages of content that we have here to discuss. As I mentioned, the document, which is PDF, was emailed to you yesterday evening and has been dropped in the chat. And I would love to, at this point, open it up for questions, comments, discussion. There is a lot to kind of go through here. One quick thing that I wanted to note before we do get started, we did receive some feedback from our interpreters after the last meeting that some folks' audio sometimes was a little difficult to hear. Sometimes people do this thing where they're kind of getting situated in their seat and they move, front and back, and it makes the audio kind of cut in and out. It's really difficult for our interpreters to interpret if they can't hear you well. So please be mindful, and I will try to do a better job of if your audio kind of sounds a little muffled or anything like that, I will rudely interrupt you just to make sure that the interpreters are not having to interpret what you're saying through that muffled sound. Okay, so here we are, and I really leave it up to the task force members here to kind of talk through this as a whole group. And, again, working really hard to not wordsmith here, really thinking about, are we asking the right questions, and thinking about how we want to go back to our subcommittee meetings with this information compiled. We can talk about that here too, kind of like the strategy, like there's a lot of information here. What's the strategy here for how we want to divide and conquer as we go back into these spaces again? So with that said, I will stop talking. I'm sure everybody's sick of hearing my voice at this point. Again, feel free to just come off mute. For folks that raise their hand, I will not be necessarily calling on you, kind of just, self-monitor, go in the order that your hand is raised. So thanks.
Should we raise our hand? I posted something in the chat as well. Just maintaining also for cumulative impacts that the status quo is to be very bureaucratic and it becomes a delay also to any form of implementation too sometimes. And recognizing that in cumulative impacts is often why our communities have already been left out. And that it's a form of cumulative impacts, bureaucracy and going from meeting to meeting. I'm not just talking about in this space, but expecting also communities to be in that space and discuss some more and not start applying at the same time that we're doing this work is an impact. It's a legitimate threat to their current, and it doesn't prioritize the current threat to their health. And we need to kind of recognize that within living context of very organic communities.
Again, I'm not going to call on folks. Like, imagine if I was not in the room and you were all like sitting around a table having a discussion. Like, this is the roundtable part. Just come off mute. I know it's hard, like with me kind of being in this facilitator role, but imagine I'm not in the room anymore. So just feel free to come off mute, and you don't necessarily need to raise your hand. But I think I saw something from Robin and then Jamie. But go ahead.
I have one comment and on a specific thing, and then like a general question/comment. So this is so exciting to see some of the recommendations and questions from some of the other subcommittees that I'm not on. And what I don't know, because I'm not on that subcommittees, is to what extent you guys have gotten information about our current practices. So I would just like to put out there that maybe Lubna and Joel could convene a group from the air division, the water division, the hazardous waste division, you know, the health side, DEHS, like the other divisions at CDPHE, and we could try to like present like, well, here is what we do on some of these pieces now. You know, like we have a tribal liaison. Her name is Rachel. I think she's out on maternity leave. I hope everything's well with her and her baby if she's listening. You know, what does she do, right? So like that could be helpful. And, you know, where do some of these questions get answered in the context of what at least this agency already does? So I feel like that could be helpful. And I would be happy to work with Lubna and Joel to, you know, convene a group at the health department to like try to answer at least some of just the factual, like, what do we do now questions. And then my comment is about cumulative impacts, because it's a real struggle for me who practices in words, right? Like to use a term like cumulative impacts, which really means different things depending on the context, right? So what it means for COGCC is not what it means, for example, the air division, because the COGCC is supposed to look at a broader set of things than the air division has jurisdiction over, right? Air agency really has jurisdiction over air and its impacts on, you know, health and air quality. So I was hoping I could ask of the equity analysis subcommittee, or just raise that, like, as you guys are talking about cumulative impacts, to make sure that you keep that context specific, right, for the agency that you're looking at and what they're doing, because it is not my opinion that cumulative impacts means the same thing for every agency. You know, and so when we say that, like, ground ourselves in what we're talking about first, right? So that would just be a request that I have. And I just didn't see in here in this question, and maybe I'm just not interpreting it a different question to include this concept. Like, when we use the term cumulative impacts, what are we talking about depending on the context? And do we mean the same thing always? So I would just make that ask of that subcommittee.
Yeah, good afternoon. This is Uni. I apologize. I'm not going to put my camera on. It's the weekend and I'm babysitting. Lubna, can I be heard okay?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. When I think of cumulative impacts, I have to change the hat that I typically wear, which is the hat of a toxicologist. And, you know, from toxicology, you think about cumulative in terms of like chemical stresses. You know, somebody's exposed to various chemicals at the same time, and there is a potential, you know, adverse impact to their health because of that, you know, accumulation of exposures. But when you think about it, and I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think when you think about it from a community perspective, you're thinking about it as accumulation of all different types of impacts, whether they're chemical stresses, non-chemical stresses like noise and odor and lights. And then you also have socioeconomic stresses in there, you know, that could, you know, create some kind of burden. And then you also include, you know, some of the positive pieces, which is still kind of elusive to understand. But I've read, you know, some literature where they consider, you know, access to technology as kind of an offset, but not necessarily something that, you know, that takes away from an environmental justice community. But thinking of it like more as accumulation of all sorts of different stresses and all sorts of different socioeconomic considerations as well as demographic considerations that lead to some kind of vulnerability of a community. So it's beyond just what the air team thinks about. It's beyond what the water team thinks about. It's a combination of all these different factors. And for that very reason, it is a really, really big challenge, because you're thinking, how do you look at quantitative data, the numbers that you can count, and think about things that are more qualitative, like how do you capture quality of life? Because that is, again, very, very subjective. It's very locale specific. So in the data group or subcommittee, it's something that we've been thinking about, what data can we bring to the table?
Your audio just kind of cut out a little bit.
Okay.
You sound a little distant suddenly.
Am I still sounding distant?
Yeah, it sounds like a little bit more like robotic. Can you like adjust your headset maybe?
No, I'm actually on my phone, so I can switch to my computer, but it'll take a couple of minutes and then I can continue my thought.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you maybe like went from speaker to, not speakerphone or something, but the audio quality just changed quickly.
Okay, I can switch.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what Uni was saying, I mean, I think I think the point is well taken that cumulative impacts includes a number of different factors. And, obviously an individual agency is not going to have jurisdiction over all of those factors. So for example, like CDPHE is not going to have jurisdiction over all of the economic stressors in a community. But the way cumulative impacts are supposed to be used in the equity analysis, at least in the applications of the equity analysis that are considered in the Environmental Justice Act, a lot of the time it's ensuring that an agency decision, so for example, permitting, is not making all of those different stressors worse or adding to those stressors. And that, sorry? Okay, never mind. So in that sense, the agency really does have jurisdiction over not necessarily all of the factors that it might study to include in that equity analysis or in that cumulative impacts analysis, but certainly does have jurisdiction over the decision that they are involved in making, which the equity analysis is intended to inform. So I guess I'm not really sure where I see that, the agency's jurisdiction should matter, should, circumscribe what goes into the equity analysis, even if the agency doesn't have jurisdiction to affect most of those stressors.
Can I try to respond to like where my head's at on that? So like, okay, let's say we're talking about an equity analysis that we want the air division to do. I'm obviously a little biased here, right? I work for the air division. So I want to know how this would work for us, right? And so is the idea that like we're not going to limit what aspects of cumulative impacts the air division looks at, but we recognize that its jurisdiction is really, and I use that term loosely and not in the legal way, but like its span of control, like its scope, right, is to look at air impacts, right? And so are we trying to set up a world where the air division is supposed to consider also the water impacts or like, and the waste impacts or the wildlife impacts, because we're not resourced to do that. We don't have the expertise to do that. And we don't have the statutory authorization to do that, right? We don't have so like, the way things are set up right now, right, is you look at the permitting structure, and a big industrial facility has to go to multiple agencies whose expertise is, you know, different pieces of that, air and water. And so what it sounds to me like what you guys are talking about, and so I practiced land use in Florida for a really long time, right? And there was, when a project was going to cross jurisdictional boundaries, right? Like it was going to be in multiple counties. There was a state agency that like looked at it from the bigger picture perspective, tried to get everybody out of their silo. And so what it sounds like you guys are talking about, and in my mind, the only way it makes practical sense, because I have to say, it doesn't, in my mind, make a ton of practical sense for the air division to take on water, waste, and wildlife impacts, right? That's, we employ air quality folks, is to have CDPHE, or there's some like broader multimedia equity analysis that's not done by the individual divisions. It's done by a separate agency, or done by CDPHE as a whole, or it's done, you know, it's done separately, because otherwise you're just, I don't understand how that would work. Maybe somebody could explain to me what you're thinking in that space.
I'll go ahead and respond, although I do see a lot of responses in the chat as well. I mean, I think that's exactly right. Like, I think that's what's envisioned by the cumulative impacts analysis, is that we can't have a cumulative impacts analysis unless there is some sort of de-siloing among expertise within the division. Otherwise, it just doesn't, you're right, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And if we are to consider other types of impacts that Uni mentioned, like, you know, economic or societal stressors, then, you know, obviously that would be based on data collection about those stressors done by other agencies, maybe even federal data. So for example, like income data by census division. And that would be noted in the analysis. So for example, like this is, you know, this is hypothetical community that we're studying is a disproportionately impacted community. So, you know, it has like this proportion of low income folks, like this proportion, and then that information can be included in the analysis or noted in the analysis, even if it is not produced by the agency studying the problem, if that makes sense.
Who is it produced by?
I mean, income data by census division, I would think you would be able to get that from the federal government.
No, I'm saying like who would do like the cumulative impact assessment for the agency who's like, are we talking about, I guess maybe let me back up. And I forgive me if like I'm just taking us down like a wonky rabbit hole, but this is like really interesting and important, and I'd like, I'm not on this subcommittee. You know, are we talking about doing an equity analysis of a community, like specifically, and finding the resources and the staff and like say like, let's look at this community and do an equity analysis of it, as opposed to where I thought we were starting is incorporating in like a specific permit application or a specific compliance action, an equity analysis or the cumulative impact assessment of a community? Or are we talking about figuring out like the scope of what that would look like in both contexts, right? Maybe that I need to back up, because, you know, I think of course we need to look at the community of a whole, but does it make sense to look at the community of as a whole and the totality of all of the impacts on that community in the context of a application for a new gas station? And how do you do that, right? And just the air division's processing of that application. So how does that work, right? And or are we talking about like what we really need to do is fund meaningful equity analyses of our disproportionately impacted communities as a whole, and we look at all of their multimedia impacts, their air impacts, their oil and gas impacts, their water impacts, this, and like those get made available to these agencies like mine as they're considering applications for new sources. Does that make sense? I guess I'm wondering like what you, if I'm understanding what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that's an open question. I'd invite others to jump in here. Like, I feel like I'm a little bit at a disadvantage because I don't know, not being part of CDPHE, I just don't know how it is structured. So I don't know, like, how you would appropriately structure an analysis like that and whether it makes more sense to do it by community or do it by permit application, and where to house that. So, I'm afraid I don't have feedback on that, but what I'm seeing in the chat and, what I would offer as well is that if we're going to do a cumulative impacts analysis, it does, I think there is like the word cumulative is in there for a reason, right? Because
Yeah, I guess
it
means
have
different
to span
things.
multiple, it does have to span then multiple silos.
I just wanted to mention one thing that kind of jumped out to me when you mentioned the APCD taking on other areas. I don't think we're asking that any division take on other areas that they aren't necessarily tasked with, but to consider impacts from other areas when they're considering new permits and do their best to avoid adding to those impacts through new permits.
So I'm finding this so interesting also. I mean, Robin, the simple answer to your question of like what is being contemplated, I don't think anyone knows, like, right? That's what this discussion is. I think even as the subcommittee, we don't have consensus by any stretch of like, what do we need by cumulative impacts analysis? Like, what would that look like? So I think this is super great discussion. And case in point, like, it seems like one of the visions is that there would be a cumulative impact analysis that looks cross media at like air, water, waste, and that's what we've been talking about. But Jamie, what I just heard you talk about was a cumulative impact analysis that instead would potentially look at all of the air impacts from different facilities in the community, not just the facility that's at question in a particular action. So those are two really different ways to look at doing a cumulative impact analysis, right? And so I guess I see our charge as a group is to try to figure out what do we think what are our recommendations about how, our recommendations of how agencies should approach it. Should it be this cross-media one? And if so, then it raises all the questions Robin was asking about, like, okay, so if a particular agency does it for a particular action, how do they also incorporate the cross-media part? To what end? Like, what's the implication? Or is it more, or would it be our recommendation to do more of a community one? Or is it more like what Jamie is saying, and we're looking at like cumulative impacts of like all the air or all the water into that community? So I think this is super fascinating, and for me, just continues to raise more questions than answers.
Yeah, I would agree with some of those comments. And I think one of the things I would love to invite all members of the task force, I think as the chair of one of the subcommittees, to be able to attend maybe once in a while some of the subcommittees, to be able to answer some of these questions. I think we have taken we have like 30 minutes left of the set of today's kind of bulk of the conversation with dedicated only to one section, which can make it difficult to support other subcommittees. So that's just a call for suggestions of being able to join in those other ones, even if it's just, like I said, year in. I had multiple other members that are not part of my subcommittee join in, and actually has created a very fruitful conversation. Also, I will say, I think we're looking at different pieces. It is the reports that we do on cumulative impacts in communities that should be across departments and agencies to actually assess what are the cumulative impacts of communities. And I think the other piece that we're looking at is how do we approve permits? And that permits most of the time tend to be inclinated to one of the agencies, and we're not looking at the cumulative impacts that are being done in some of the others aspects. And I think that is a conversation that we should continue to have. But I think every one of the agencies produces that report, and most of the time they're not talking to each other on the reports that they're producing. So that's just an aspect I would like to elevate.
Thanks,
Michael,
Elena.
I think you were
Can
next.
you hear me now? Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Uni, yeah, if you wanted to finish your thought, I apologize for cutting you off earlier. If you wanted to just finish your train of thought, and then maybe we could go Kimberly and then Michael, Gary, Jonathan.
Okay, no, I mean, I think what I was getting at was this is a question that's being wrestled with across all the different states. For example, New Jersey has a scoring method that if you fall above it, then your permit could get denied, or you would have to have like special considerations for your permit. And so it is important when it comes to permitting. And I think that's what I wanted to add on to it. It's establishing some kind of threshold above which your permit requirements might change depending on the vulnerability of the community. That's all I wanted to add. Thanks, Lavna.
Yeah, thanks for finishing that train of thought. I think that was important for people to hear. And, you know, a nod to Ilda too, that, you know, not to go too down the rabbit hole with just, you know, one of these sections of the proposed recommendation topics. But yeah, I'll turn it back over to task force members to continue.
Thanks, Livna. I you know, one thing that I'm struggling with a little bit too in thinking about cumulative analysis, and I think this is where Tricia and some others were going as well, is a lot of times the state agencies that's reviewing the permit is reviewing the permit specific to their area of expertise. The air division is reviewing the permit specific to air. But a lot of time with a development or any kind of type of development, the state agency is not the one directing where that location is or where that impact is. And so there has to be some component, and I know we don't have the local government rep on here, but there has to be some component within this structure that sort of allows for, or to some extent requires, the state agency to engage in the local process, because that also is going to have a sort of formulate how the community as a whole is impacted based on where the local governments are allowing various and different types of development. Even with large scale projects that the PUC does, the local government has some impact on that. And so I think that there has to be, well, we're talking very specifically about state agencies, but if you're looking at cumulative impacts as a whole, and other people were touching on this, there's infrastructure for traffic, there's infrastructure for other types of needs as development comes in. And I think that has to be a component of cross-agency coordination. It has to include the local government piece.
Well, I can say that I am thoroughly enjoying the conversation, because originally when I thought of cumulative impacts, I thought of it more like Tricia. If one entity was going for a permit, that it meant that you needed to look at all the existing facilities or other facilities in the area, and not just that one individual one, and see how that together cumulatively impacts the communities that are around those facilities. But Uni's point, and a number of the other task force members, that maybe it's more than just air. Obviously the economic side. For me, getting the opportunity to represent workers, there's thousands, and they're in the same communities. So the first thing we always care about here at the local is the worker safety and health, and we want to make sure that those workers aren't being put in a position where their safety is at risk or their health is at risk. But we also have to acknowledge that those workers depend on those jobs to support themselves and their families. So I think getting an opportunity for that piece to be examined and part of the conversation is important for me. I saw Robin's comment in the chat box about possibly a recommendation that we have the legislature do cumulative impact analysis and require the various agencies to take that into consideration when they're going through their permitting process. Seems like a viable tool and a possible great recommendation. I think it's important we continue to have these conversations, because I'm with Mira. I know pretty well how things work at the AQCC, because I've had the chance to serve on the commission there. But some of the other processes I'm just not, tremendously familiar with. And so it's hard for me to figure out how do we make recommendations that are specific with measurable goals so we can have good outcomes. And as long as we can continue to have these conversations or Robin's suggestion of maybe we have folks present and kind of explain how things are being done right now and have a better understanding on how we can improve them moving forward, seems like a valuable tool that the task force can use. So I appreciate, everybody sharing their information because it's helping me a whole lot today. Thank you.
I'll just jump in and note, I know that Joel and Lubna did survey the agencies and then provided like a summary of some of the questions. So maybe we can refresh or drop that in for folks. I know it doesn't answer all of the questions by any stretch. I mean, I've been working at CDPHE for 9 years and I still learn things about how the agency works. So I don't pretend to think that that's going to answer everyone's questions, but it could help provide at least some basic information. And then whatever is helpful beyond that, as Robin said, we'd be very happy to help provide information or answer questions.
Thanks, Tricia. Joel just dropped the link to the results of that survey in the chat. That was from our second equity analysis subcommittee meeting. We also do welcome your feedback on other ways that we can present the results of that survey. I know it was a lot, and like each kind of page is like each slide is provides like survey results, but like if there's ideas on how to make that a little bit more visual and digestible, not only for our task force members, but maybe for the broader community, I welcome those suggestions, even if it's here in the chat or if you want to send me an email later. Michael, I see you've had your hand raised for some time, so I want to make sure we get to you, and then Jamie. And then also I noticed, Jonathan, your hand was raised earlier and you lowered it. So I don't know if somebody made your point, but would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, I think this has been a really great discussion, and this is Mike Sepp coming from, I was appointed as a person of color to represent those communities, and I find the community engagement and all of the tactics, Lubna, that you kind of outlined to be extremely helpful in bringing people to the table and, adhering to what we're trying to accomplish through the EJ Act. The only thing that I had, I kind of jotted this down when you were talking, was on the data and health disparities section. There was a bullet for community scientists, and just wanted to know if we could expand on what does that mean specifically. I know that it was, when I saw it, it was really designed to kind of help some of our undocumented brothers and sisters who may not want to, put their information in like the U.S. Census. But what does that mean, and what does that mean? And then secondly, and this is to the group, and it kind of gets to Gary's point. What about the engagement, the analysis from the business, the industry community that are having to meet a lot of the legislative declarations, requirements, a lot of the regulatory requirements to kind of meet some of the DI requirements and some of the environmental justice requirements that were outlined in 1266. So how does that kind of play into everything as well? Just curious. And if we could add a bullet to that recognizes the work that the business and the industry community are playing in this space as well.
Yeah, Michael, just to your first point regarding community scientists, that is it's a very broad recommendation, utilizing community scientists, which formerly we used to say citizen science, but we don't say that anymore. How we can bridge the gap that census data is not collecting. And that is a broad recommendation. I think the recommendation as it stands right now is that, community science should be involved, but what the question you're proposing is something that the task force needs to discuss about, like, how can we be more specific about that and to what extent?
Can I add on to that, Lubna, really quickly? So I think, Michael, what we're proposing is that kind of recognizing, to Robin's point, you know, that the agencies can't do everything and industry can't either. And this is a community, industry, agencies kind of collaboration, and how communities can be trained and how can they collect data on their water in their house, the air around where they live, and that also be considered valid data and influence decision-making processes as well. Because of being underfunded and so much capacity needed, the community can play a role in solving some of these issues. So I think that's really what we're getting to. And then maybe there's opportunities for other funding streams, right? The nonprofit sector, universities, that the funding comes from different areas. And then that way, the bulk of the work isn't just an agency or an industry. And we as community members can play a key part in solving some of these issues. So I think that's where I see that building up that capacity in community.
I think that's awesome in community capacity building. When I read it and when I heard Lubna speak to it, I didn't capture that. So you providing that context really helps me. And I appreciate you giving additional background. Thank you.
Yeah, Beatriz, 100%. That's something that we have discussed in the best practices of community engagement, as the government might not be the best messenger, industry definitely not be the most trusted messenger, and how are we utilizing these community spaces and actually citizen-led conversations to create that trust that it's going to take a long time for even to the state agencies to have from community members.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was just said by both Beatriz and thank you both for those comments. And I just wanted to say I fully admit that I don't totally understand how things work at CDPHE, especially interdepartmentally. And I don't necessarily have a deep understanding of what it takes for industry to make changes. But what I do understand is that coming from a disproportionately impacted community that's impacted by a myriad of different environmental injustices, it's heartbreaking, and I can't fathom trying to take on any more than we already are. We're already trying to play whack-a-mole. Every time I turn around, it seems like we're learning about a new environmental problem in our community. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And we're not, I was really proud to be appointed to this committee or this task force because I'm hoping to change that. And I know this task force can't accomplish that all by ourselves, and the CDPHE can't necessarily either. But if we just continue the same ways of doing things, that's not going to be really anything that I feel like I can walk away from this task force being proud of. So I know it's going to be difficult. I understand that, but something has to change. So, maybe this is where we have to figure out how those changes are made. Maybe we have to figure out on this task force how to do things differently, but just doing things the same way can't go on. It just, like I say, we are at our limit here trying to address water issues and air issues, myriad air issues with air toxics and climate issues. We're having climate impacts here in Pueblo. A lot of our community doesn't understand that, just because we have multiple rivers and streams running through our community, that doesn't mean that we have plenty of water. A lot of our water in the Arkansas River comes from the western slope through Trans Mountain diversions, and that's the same for communities all along the Front Range. So what affects their water necessarily affects ours. And as we watch this extended drought drain the Colorado River of its life, that's going to impact us as well. And so we have all these issues compounding each other, and the silos are part of the problem. The fact that we've been trying to address these things separately is part of the problem. It's all one problem. That's all I really wanted to get out there. But, this is where these changes need to start, is on these kind of task forces and these kind of committees. So thank you.
I appreciate you, Jamie, and your passion for your community too, honestly. And we're the EJ Coalition is honestly at an advantage right now to recognize that connectedness. We can recognize in data intersectional overlaps in a way that agencies haven't before and community sciences can back up. We can honestly have community now bring in these type of cultural contexts because agencies never have as a norm. So at the same time that this does feel daunting, it's an advantage to fill in the holes, be able to recognize where, yes, we have to work in duality. Agencies should have maintained these forms of equity analysis and haven't, or they would have already been authentically sustained and we wouldn't have to be here. And community monitoring with intersectional overlaps can be seen as a form of cumulative impacts from here on out, where communities can also educate themselves. We can build sustainable schools in that space. Like this can actually expand to a lot more sectors. And that connectedness is really key because if we're going to talk about jobs and socioeconomic status, it does start there too.
Well, I think I'm next up in the queue, and sorry for this being a little jilted or out of sequence. It's not in response to what Jamie and Renee were just talking about, but rather relates back to the conversation on community science and opportunities for communities to gather information and submit that information, have to be part of decision-making processes. And as the water quality rep on the task force, I just wanted to share that we do have that happening in water quality. So there's a program called River Watch, and it really is about training and teaching people to gather data in their community, in their watersheds, in areas that are important to them. And so there's assistance from both CDPHE as well as Colorado Parks and Wildlife to support that organization and that association to train community members in, how to do it, how to do all of the quality assurance, quality control stuff, so that then when that data then is submitted to CDPHE, we can consider that in evaluating what is the health of the stream, and should it be listed as an impaired stream, and it certainly has been a really valuable source of information in some decisions by the Water Quality Control Commission and looking at the health of streams in various communities across the state.
Just real quick, I appreciate you bringing that up. I am actually trained and have been an active tester for the Colorado River Watch program for the Fountain Creek, and I really give a lot of props to that program, and I wish that we could still have more engagement here in Pueblo. But that's exactly part of the problem, is that we're lacking resources to even address a lot of these problems or even start gathering the data. And we've just recently had a similar situation where we were trying to get an EPA grant for improved air monitoring here with the ARP funding. And we were well on our way through this grant, and we were partnered with CDPHE and the Pueblo Department of Public Health and Environment. They were going to actually be the administrators of the grant, and real close to the end of putting this grant application together, the PDPHE had to back out of it because they lack the resources to be able to administer a grant like that. So what we're finding is our disproportionately impacted communities lack even the basic resources to be able to take advantage of resources that are offered to us. And so, like, it's the same thing with the Riverwatch program. We fizzled out because we don't have people who have the time to be able to get out there and test the water. It's not that they don't have the interest, it's that they're strapped already as it is.
Thanks, Jamie. Uni, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what Jamie said earlier. I think across the country, there is a recognition that status quo does not work, in that we can no longer permit facilities as just on their own, like they exist in an island on their own. Cumulative impacts have to be a part of it. There is an ongoing discussion at the federal level through the EPA. They had a science advisory board meeting just geared towards a discussion around cumulative impacts. They have a white paper, which I think CDPHE might share, just to give an idea of what the agency is thinking and how they're thinking, how they're going to incorporate the whole cumulative analysis into permitting and siting and all these different processes that impact environmental justice communities. So there is a recognition that it can't be done on its own. And so I think as a task force, it would be helpful if we kind of tracked how the EPA is planning to move this conversation forward.
Thanks all. This has been super informative. I want to kind of take a moment and also would love to hear from some of the folks that we haven't heard from, because I know people have ideas and thoughts. And so, Sheila and Mara and even Elizabeth, I know that you're a slightly newer member. Doug, like folks that we haven't heard as much from, we would love to hear from you as well. But kind of, I want to think about, is there, in terms of the content that was put together in what we are just generally discussing, are there any like glaring areas that we feel like we're missing information that we're like not touching on at all at this point? Because at the very least, we want to make sure that we don't have gaps in like the conversations that we are having. I feel like the recurring questions and the recommendations, there's a lot to like parse out within them, but is there areas, that we're just overlooking? Does anybody feel that there is something missing? Well, that's good. I'm not hearing anybody saying that there's any like glaring gaps in like the conversations that we should be having. Obviously, there's a lot that we still need to discuss. And if folks do feel anything is missing, please drop that in the chat or feel free to raise your hand at any point. If we do, feel like yeah, let me just quickly check this chat. Yes, that is a very valid concern, Mira, that this is like it can be really daunting to like look at all of this, but I'm hoping that, again, we are thinking about how to tackle each of these sections in the subcommittees, right? This is why we form the subcommittees, is that dedicating space, and time to have these conversations. The number of questions and the number of like high level recommendations is large, but I feel like a lot of what we've been doing in our subcommittee spaces is like this download of information. Sometimes we invite presenters to speak, and we have been, we started the first equity analysis subcommittee with like, what does an equity analysis mean to you? And so while those conversations are still relevant, we are kind of moving into the recommendation stage. And so with that in mind, I want to ask, like, do we feel like we're on track to work through these draft recommendations and have this be a starting document and work through them during our subcommittees over the next couple of months, so that we are in a place to provide, at least a really simple framework or some draft recommendations to get public input by June? Do we feel like we're in that place, or and that's how we can utilize our time in these subcommittees over the next couple of months? Our next full task force meeting, where we're all getting back together, is in June. And so we'll be relying on those shorter meetings and spaces where we're not all together to be kind of getting into the nitty gritty of that. So I want to get thoughts there on kind of just like bird's eye view. How are people feeling, and are there suggestions on what more can be done? Even as your staff, is there suggestions on what we should be doing to improve the process?
Hey, Lubna. I'm not, oh, great. I think for me, like a good lesson from today is that there are a lot of really good conversations happening in the subgroups, but maybe there's not a ton of visibility from, other folks kind of in other subgroups, and maybe there's value in, having some level of an opportunity for kind of more visibility. I mean, I think, for instance, Robin's technical expertise and kind of being able to look at something and or other folks that can look and say, not only is this a good idea, but how do we make it actionable and implementable, would be valuable before we kind of have a product that goes more broad. And so I'm not sure if how the system kind of accounts for us then coming back together to kind of, talk about so much of the conversation today about de-siloing, like maybe there's kind of a value in de-siloing this process a little bit too, so that we're all, continuing to kind of, QA, QC the other subcommittees. And I think today's conversation was very valuable from that perspective. And I kind of hope that that continues so that when we do actually have a product that goes more for broad public consumption and public feedback, we're maybe catching some of those things and again, kind of de-siloing before that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jonathan. And, to that point, to your initial point of like, there might not be enough of like different task force members in different spaces and we may be siloing on our own. One thing that I might suggest, if it's not too much, is that we have these subcommittee task force member assignments. We've shared this spreadsheet that kind of shows where each person is sitting, and it might be good for folks to kind of review this. If folks kind of want to change this up and like shift which subcommittee they're sitting on or be added to a certain subcommittee, we're happy to do that. Alternatively, I could also send all of the calendar invitations to all of the task force members, and then you all could decide, if you have the availability to, even if you're not on the Indigenous Community Engagement Subcommittee, if you're available that evening and you think you can attend, that you would have that as a calendar invitation. So just some kind of thoughts and ideas on how we might be able to like further prevent that siloing is, one, either you all kind of telling us if you want to like shift subcommittees or be added to another subcommittee, or, option two, which is like kind of sharing all of the calendar invitations with all of you so that you might be able to attend. And Joel, I see you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Lumna. I do want to add and give you credit that Lumna and Morgan have worked really hard to make sure that there are really good, concise summaries of every subcommittee meeting, pretty promptly posted in the folders for each subcommittee. So if you go on the public Google Drive, which I just shared a link to for the subcommittees, you can actually read like a 1 to 2, every once in a while, 3-page summary of each meeting and see what the other subcommittees are discussing. So we're trying really hard to keep that available for all of you and the public. And then to kind of go to, I think, another component of what you were recommending, Jonathan, you all are already putting in a lot of time as the task force members and volunteering your time, and we are your staff, right, in the environmental justice unit. So we're sort of uniquely well positioned to do some of that background work after we hear your broad ideas to fill in sort of in what is happening now, connecting across CDPHE or even with other state agencies, and really helping to identify, I think you're trying to get at, Jonathan, like the audience for how we make different recommendations actionable. And I think that we can kind of work on that as we get more direction from each subcommittee on, okay, there's a recommendation on making sure that all agencies have a tribal liaison. We know CDPHE has one now. We can coordinate with the Colorado Commission on Indian Affairs to identify which agencies maybe don't have one now, but that could be beneficial for example. So I think that can be our role as staff, and we would definitely rely a lot, I think, on the expertise of the task force members who are representatives from state agencies, particularly folks like Doug and and Marcia and Elizabeth who represent agencies outside of CDPHE where maybe we have less connections, but hopefully we're able to bridge some of that gap as your staff, to your point, Jonathan, to make sure that we are getting input from everyone who's doing this work now on what the status quo is, to make sure that the recommendations of the task force are really tailored to the right audience and what adjustments might need to be made to the status quo rather than recommending something that's already happening. So I hope that's kind of responsive to what you were suggesting, Jonathan. And if we're off track, please let us know and we can adjust.
If I could, just real quick before we get to public comment section, I just want to acknowledge Mira's comment in the chat about the number of questions in the document being a bit daunting. And I feel the same way. I agree. As we were going through them, I did find myself feeling like there was an awful lot in there that applies to my community. But I do think that it would be good if we can whittle that down some. Maybe some of them have some overlap where we can kind of find a way to combine some of that into one issue or something. I'm not sure how we do that, but just kind of want to acknowledge that comment and my agreement with it.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie and Mira, for initiating that conversation. So definitely, this is like, I can't tell you how many pages of notes. And so a lot of different questions. I think for us as your staff, we just wanted to make sure that we weren't missing anything. I think boiling it down, condensing is definitely where we go from here. And so I think that's a good proposal, I guess, on your part, Jamie, is like, maybe this is how we spend some of our time in the subcommittee meetings, is kind of looking at the questions and seeing where there is overlap, not only within the questions, but within other like subcommittees, and seeing where we might want to kind of take those conversations. And in addition to that, kind of taking those questions and moving them to the recommendation section. Like, there's a lot of questions and some people might be like, well, this is a silly question. Like, of course we should do this, and really kind of getting into the more specifics about that. So I think that's a good prompt for how we might be able to spend our time. Beatriz.
I just want to pose another question, Lubna, and I want to thank you for all the hard work you've done too. And kind of recognizing what Jamie said is that we're not going to be able to fix all of it right now. And is there also maybe with the expertise we have on the agencies of like phases and putting it like in buckets of, we can't answer this question until we resolve X, right? Or maybe there's like timeframes of how we achieve like the overall goal and what needs to happen to get there too. So I'm also thinking of like how we can think about steps and metrics to get to the end goal. I think would be also really helpful, because obviously I think what we're talking about is structural change of how our agencies work and speak to each other. So there's definitely like institutional and structural changes that need to happen, and that takes time, and it's not easy. So yeah, how can we also have like be very intentional about like timeline and what needs to happen first, or the second or the third thing to happen and be achievable.
And Beatriz, just to like clarify around that, are you like suggesting kind of like talking about these like phases in terms of our specific timeline between now and November, or in terms of like the life beyond the recommendations?
I'm thinking about the life beyond the recommendations.
All right, well, I know there's a slight lull in the conversation here. Public comment does begin at 2. Morgan and Joel, this will give your fingers a break. They're taking extensive notes. We are at we are combining the notes all into one document from Tuesday and today, and we're at almost page 30 now, folks. So extensive notes being taken, and we are capturing all these great ideas. And I think there was some really robust conversation that happened today that will continue to inform the draft recommendations that we'll be developing for June. I wanted to go ahead and give folks about like a 5-minute break before we get into public comment. Before we do take a quick break, I do just want to encourage folks that, one, it may feel early for you all to provide feedback on the document that I sent to you all yesterday, and makes total sense because it's going to change very drastically. This is like a draft of a draft. And so as we sit in our subcommittees, it's gonna be formed very differently. It's gonna look very different in a couple months from now. That said, if you have any like burning recommendations that you're like, I just read through this section and I have 5 different ideas and I need to get them on paper, send those to us, please. Written comments, written recommendations are very, very welcome and will just help us focus a lot more. So if it's all up here and you want to get it on paper and send it to us, please do. That said, unless there's anything anybody wants to say right before we head out for break, we'll just break for a quick 5 minutes and come back at 2:05 if that works for folks.
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Robin.
I just wanted to offer that, and I can only speak for my agency, right? Is that I think there's the understanding, like where we're starting is that the status quo is not okay, right? And please recognize that. And my comments today are because my brain goes right to, how do I do this? How do we do this? And how do we do it effectively? And so I just want to reinforce that the Air Division and CDPHE are so committed to doing this and like recognizing that the status quo is not okay and we want to do better. And I just can't reinforce that enough. And I'm so grateful to the EJ unit for facilitating this and for everybody for participating and pushing us. And I can't help that my brain is like, okay, what does that mean? Like literally, what do I do? Right? How do I do it? And so that was the spirit in which I was working today. And I wanted just to make sure that was clear. So thank you.
No worries. Thanks, Robin. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else have anything they'd like to share before we head out for a 5-minute break?
Actually, I do. This is Christy Douglas. I am a council person for Commerce City. However, I am just here as a community member today. But my thought on this is that I'm seeing 2 different perspectives here. I'm seeing the perspective from the Bureau as a bureaucracy, and I'm seeing the industry perspective. And then I'm also seeing the impacted communities perspective. I really think the most important one is the community's perspective. So I just want to throw that out there and for everyone to consider. Because at the end of the day, you're the health department. And so that's what you're charged with, protecting the health of the people. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Appreciate your perspectives, and please do keep in mind that we are starting public comment in 5 minutes. We're going to break, and then would love for you to kind of, if you have further thoughts and want to elaborate on that, we welcome that. And so with that, we will go ahead and break for 5 minutes. Let's plan to be back here at 2:08. You know, it's a very specific time, but 2:08. See you in a few minutes. All right, welcome back, folks. Okay, so hopefully people are back at their desks at this time. I do want to open it up for public comment. My camera is not on, okay. I do want to open it up for public comment. Joel has dropped the lineup or the queue of folks that would like to provide public comment into the chat. The first couple folks, Velma and Maya, so they definitely want to provide public comment, and then the last three folks listed so that they might. I'm assuming that there might be some other folks also not listed that may want to provide public comment. And so if you're joining the meeting and would like to provide some input, let us know that you would like to provide public comment by indicating so in the chat. I am going to, because we do have a decent amount of folks providing public comment, I'm going to go ahead and put up the public comment timer for 5 minutes. Keep in mind that you will have 5 minutes to provide public comment in either English or in Spanish. Please try not to exceed the 5 minutes. If we have time, if we've kind of gotten through everybody that has provided public comment, we will kind of do the style that we have been, which we'll kind of just like leave it open for discussion and let people come off mute more casually. But we just want to ensure that we are able to hear from everybody. So with that said, we will go ahead and turn it over to Velma. You are the first person on our list for folks who provide public comment. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick screen share here and go ahead and get our timer started. Thanks, Velma.
Hi. Excuse me. Thank you for the opportunity. I was actually hoping for another minute to listen to other folks, but I'll go ahead and start. For those who don't know me, I'm Velma Campbell. I'm a public health physician from Pueblo, Colorado. And I'll give a shout out to our Pueblo community organizer, Jamie Valdez, who we're real proud to have on this task force. And I really appreciate this task force and the Associated Environmental Justice Board and the Environmental Justice Office as a beginning part of a process that is going to be the subject of my comment. I think it's key when we're just, and what I'm addressing is that discussion about the it relates to the environmental equity and the cumulative impact analyses, but it really, that discussion really gets to a big part of why we're here in the first place. So I think it's key to remember that the reason for these environmental regulations in general, to get real basic, is so that industry can be allowed to discharge wastes into our community. That's the fundamental process in which we work, is the process of identifying the allowable pollution. That's a privilege and an externalization of what should be costs of production. In other words, a subsidy by being allowed to discharge into our communities. Nevertheless, communities, the subject of the discharges, have been treated as outsiders or spectators, or even worse, as nuisances, when in fact we should be in the forefront of those processes, since it's our communities receiving the emissions or discharges. Communities have to be included early on in any and all regulatory processes. In other words, nothing about us without us. Just as community members are expected to learn and address the language and structures of agencies and industries when we want to participate in processes directly related to our quality of life and health, this process is about the agencies and the industries putting the communities first and learning, having the obligation to learn the language and structures and issues of communities as a requisite part of the regulatory process, rather than as an adjunct or auxiliary part of the process, as a sideline to receive community comments in order to be able to say as a formality that that box was ticked off. So I think our agencies, I think one of the functions of these analyses should be to provide a basis similar to an environmental impact statement for the other divisions to access and consideration of permits, and then to be able to add any new information back into those analyses. So every permit application, yes, should include consideration of the community impact analysis. It doesn't mean that a water department is going to address an air impact, but every department should be aware of and acknowledge those impacts as part of their processes and receive community input, not as an adjunct, but as fundamental to whether or not those permits are issued or are modified. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate your public comment. Great. So moving on, and I think I just want to note that we will have an opportunity to for task force members to kind of talk with our members of the public so that there's more of a conversation around these public comments. And so we'll do that as soon as we get through our list. Maya, I will turn it over to you.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, my connection is not the best. So my name is Maya, I live in Denver, and this is my first public comment and time listening to this meeting. So thank you so much for all of your hard work for the community. I apologize if my suggestions are not right on the money of what a task force is designed to do. I think one maybe helpful piece of feedback as a member of the public, it's very difficult for me to know kind of the outside limitations on your recommendations and what exactly this task force can and can't recommend about. So I would say that that's maybe one thing that could be more clear to the public. And with that said, these are the kind of things as a member of the public that surprised me or struck me in reading the document and hearing you guys read through it so helpfully. The first thing that kind of struck me was the pace of a lot of the recommendations. I noticed a lot of the recommendations are related to data gathering and analyzing cumulative impact and these sort of long-term processes where to get any like quote unquote legitimate data, you need a number of years. And that struck me as good, but also not enough because of the timeline that we're working on, not just with climate change where IPCC says we have 3 years to kind of turn this ship around, but also because of the very urgent health and community impacts that people suffer on the basis of these problems. And so I think that there could be more room for recommending existing action based on what's already being said, based on monitoring that's already happened, or just experiences that are already being articulated, right? Like we're not hearing Cherry Creek residents talk about how bad their health is impacted by industry in their area, right? We're hearing that from Commerce City folks and folks like me, even who live in the range of, for example, the Suncor refinery pollution. And so I think that the committee could recommend a bit more on how we can act on that knowledge already, because I think that even though it's coming from people's voices as opposed to a spreadsheet, it's very important and very worthwhile data. And we already kind of know the problems in our communities. And I think there could be more recommendations speaking to, okay, right now, what are we going to do about that? What do we already know are the problematic industries or problematic industrial sites or directly impacted, cumulatively impacted communities, even before we get into that very important analysis kind of on the margins of, okay, how do we measure cumulative impact, and what about, you know, directly impacted communities that are gentrifying, and these very crucial analysis questions. I think we can kind of get started even without answering those questions in addressing those concerns that have already been so loudly articulated. So that's one thing. And then I guess just in general, it feels like maybe the recommendations could have a little more chutzpah in terms of, you know, these recommendations are just recommendations. And if I'm wrong about that, maybe that's my own misunderstanding. But my understanding is they're just recommendations. So naturally, whenever you give a recommendation to any government entity, you're going to get probably about 5% of what you recommended, right? And so my question as a citizen is there anything y'all can do to have this go farther, you know, to really push the limits of what can be recommended, from, you know, getting into housing policy? Okay, as we pursue these kind of EJ issues, how do we prevent gentrification? You know, can we get into workforce policy? Someone mentioned here how there's this trade-off of allowing industry in cumulatively impacted locations because those impacted communities need the jobs. And as a listener, I think, well, why is that the paradigm? Why can't we suggest a new paradigm? Why can't we recommend to these to the bureaus and to the legislature to, you know, invest in green job training, to pay union members of plants that need to phase out their existing salary until they find a new equally paid position? Like, why can't we reimagine what's possible here, especially since these are just recommendations, or even in the indigenous community section? I think it's a fantastic idea to rename these industrial plants to not, you know, be named after indigenous people who were genocided in order to build those plants. But at the same time, what bureaus and legislators have power to return land to indigenous peoples, to require that a particular tribe or indigenous group who's impacted has veto power over in the regulatory process over a particular suggestion. So I don't know if all of these suggestions are right on the money for what this task force could do, because again, I have trouble understanding the parameters. But in general, I think as a citizen listening, that's my perspective of, okay, how can we go even further, especially considering all your recommendations may not be taken. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maya. Appreciate your public comments. I am looking at the time and it looks like we have plenty of time. We have until 3 p.m. for our public comments. So I actually do, between Velma's comment and Maya's comment, I wonder if some of the task force members would like to respond or provide input. You know, I want to give people kind of the opportunity for that two-way exchange rather than just kind of hearing from you all and there being like no acknowledgement. So if any task force members would like to come off mute in response to Velma or Maya's comments, I welcome that now.
I appreciate you and I'm so grateful for you. And as we were discussing too, Lubna, having a form of a Jamboard and really getting to that too is also a form of community engagement and community data. And I really appreciate that being seen as that too. So thank you so much for your comments and all of your questions.
Yeah, and thanks Renee for that. And just so folks know, during our last co-chairs meeting between Beatriz, Renee, and I, we talked about kind of using a Jamboard for our next equity analysis subcommittee meeting. So if there's other subcommittees that feel that would be useful, you know, we're happy to kind of set that up and have that be a way to capture comments and questions and feedback there as well. Yeah, Velma, go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to react to part of Maya's comment and appreciate her comment in general. The part I wanted to react to is to agree, like much applause with the comment that too often we hear calls for more studies, we need more research and so forth and so on. That is very different from our calls for more data. And the difference is this, as I can tell you, and I know there are a lot of public health people on this call, so I'm certainly don't want to suggest I'm the only one, but there are plenty for many, while many chemicals go unstudied that are emitted into our environment, for many chemicals, there are plenty of studies showing the adverse effects of pollution. For air pollution in general, many studies documenting the adverse effects of those pollution, certainly more than enough to justify actions to reduce pollution, even legally authorized pollution in our communities. When we say we need more data, what we in the communities mean is that we lack community-based monitoring and data to document the pollution levels in our communities, not necessarily a body count to show that the pollution that's being emitted into our communities is bad for our health. That already exists. And so I wanted to make sure and to really get behind Maya's comment that action is what's called for in many of these situations, because if the pollution is there and can be documented to be there, either from emissions data or from community monitoring, frequently there's more than enough scientific evidence to justify protective actions.
Thanks, Velma, for that additional comment. Any of our task force members want to react to Velma or Maya? Welcome on to the next commenter. Well, I see a lot of comments in the chat. Oh, Beatriz.
No, I think this all goes back to Renee's comment earlier that while we're waiting for data to justify environmental justice in our communities, we already have people that are suffering. We're already having people that are suffering the consequences. And it's like, how do we act with urgency in the current state of communities while we are collecting data? So I don't think by any means we're suggesting that we need to wait to have actionable items today versus, continue to have better information and resources across agencies and have the agencies speak to each other.
While I'm not a task force member, I do want to just add to what Beatriz said and put in a plug for really one of the best repositories and places to find all that data that we do have now, which is Colorado EnviroScreen, that many folks have heard us talk about during this meeting. We are right now in the middle of the public beta testing phase for Colorado EnviroScreen, which means that anyone can just go on and take a look at the tool. I put a link to it in the chat and really see this is our culmination of data sets on multiple health indicators, multiple environmental indicators, multiple demographic indicators. Just see how we're doing and give us some feedback. We actually have a large public meeting planned to get feedback on Monday night. You can register at the site that I just linked. So for folks who are kind of wondering, like, what is the state of the data now and what can we do with the data that we currently have, I would really encourage you to go test out EnviroScreen, fill out that questionnaire at the top of the page to give us feedback, and maybe come to our public meeting on Monday and let us know what you think there and learn more.
Joel, can you drop the registration link for the public meeting on Monday in the chat so people know where to find that? And this is the public meeting for EnviroScreen on Monday evening. I believe it is taking place from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Thanks, Joel. Michael, I saw you come off mute for a second. I wasn't sure if you had anything that you wanted to share.
I just want to thank all of the speakers for your time on Saturday. good conversations, and just know that I'm listening and just appreciate you.
And I want to comment on, and I think there were a lot of comments in the chat in terms of the way that Velma articulated, we often ask the community to sort of get educated on the processes, either from industry or from the agencies as a whole. And I think that one of the things, and the community engagement subcommittee is something that I've been thinking a lot about this in that context of what does it look like to ensure that those agencies and those industries are getting educated about the community, and how do you engage the community in such a way that you're learning about individual community. And so I think as we dig deeper into the recommendations for the subcommittee, that is a key piece, and you articulated it so well that it really struck me as I think that was just an easy way to say it is, look, you ask us to educate ourselves, but are you educating yourselves? And I think that is something that we need to look at how we put that into a recommendation, because it's so important.
Thanks, Kimberly. And Velma, I'm sure you've seen the chat, but just, our task force members welcoming written public comments from you if you would like to provide them. And Joel just sent the email address where you can send those if you'd like to. Okay, so I do want to give anybody else that would like to provide public comment an opportunity. We had Jared C. Bynum as a potential maybe would like to provide public comment. I do not see Jared, but I do see a phone number on here. So Jared, if you are here, please come off mute and feel free to share your public comment. Okay, not hearing Jared. And so we also have Christy Douglas. Christy, I know we heard from you just a little bit before the break, but if you wanted to provide further public comment. I don't see a lot more members of the public on here, so I am going to refrain from using the annoying clock for the remainder of our time. So Christy, if you would like to come off mute, feel free.
Thank you so much. I was trying to do that, and I apologize for not being on camera, but I do not have a camera on this computer that works. So you'll just have to bear with my name being on the screen. And I do want to apologize for interjecting the way I did at the end of the task force session of this. But I felt it appropriate to say that at the end before you took a break, because I wanted the task force to take that perspective with them before public comment. So that really wasn't what I was planning on doing. I just felt that it was necessary to do at that point. So I do apologize for that. But I would really like, well, first of all, I'd really like to tell you that I appreciate all of you taking the effort or making the effort to put a task force together. This is something that has never been done before. And being from Commerce City, this is something that has been a long time coming. So I do appreciate the fact that there is a task force. And I'd also like to acknowledge the comments that were made by members of the task force to the public, especially Beatrice and Renee, Michael, and Kimberly. So thank you for those heartfelt comments that you made. So what I did take away that I liked from what was put out there as far as what you're thinking about doing as a task force, part of it was that you wanted to include data from stories. And I think that is really, really, really important. Numbers don't always tell the story, but personal stories from people who have been impacted do contribute to, or they should contribute to the data. That should be an integral part of it. I really appreciate what Jamie and also Velma said about that the burden of onus should not be put on the community. We've got enough to deal with without proving how we have been burdened with the impacts of basically industry. And most of those industries, I understand, are providing energy to us, but why do we have to be the ones who are sacrificing for everyone else's benefit? It just doesn't seem to be right. And then to have to prove that we're being impacted negatively shouldn't be added to our plates. So I want you to take that into consideration. The other thing that I'd like you to really take to heart are Maya's comments. Please, let's think about reimagining our situation so that we don't have to have a task force such as this, so that we don't have to worry about impacted communities. Right now, our leaders are asking for more drilling because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. Why aren't we taking this opportunity, instead of to do more drilling, doing more of the same? Why aren't we taking this opportunity to move directly into the new age of green energy, a new economy, creating a new economy for ourselves, retraining workers, getting off oil and gas instead of producing more. And most of it that we produce here is for export, and we have to admit that. They have us believing it is for our own use, and it is not. It's about the money makers. So we have to take all of this into account, and then maybe we wouldn't all have to be spending a Saturday afternoon here trying to figure this out. If we just listen to the words of young people like Maya, who can see the future for what it should be. So I thank you for your time, and thank you for not putting on the timer. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Christy. Any task force members have anything they would like to share in response? Great, thank you so much, Christy, for your comments. Jared Bynum, I will turn it over to you. As we mentioned, we are trying to stick to about 5 minutes, but because we only have one more, maybe two more people providing public comment after you, I'll keep the timer off, but please be just cognizant of your time. Thank you.
And Lubna, before we start, I want to just double check our interpretation is working, because one of our interpreters had to hop on and off. So Gisela, I'm going to hop into the Spanish channel and just make sure I can still hear you. If you can go ahead and speak really quickly. Gisela, yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks for always being on top of the interpretation. Appreciate
Yes,
it.
I apologize for the interruption there. We are ready to go. So
cool. Thanks, Jared. It's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lubna, and thank you for double checking that, Joel. I just wanted to give a big shout out to all of the task force members and for state staffers who took the time to ensure that there were multiple meetings for this third session of the EJATF. Making sure that we can be more inclusive for diverse members of our community. That's really much appreciated. I kind of have like a two-part comment and two-part question for members of the task force. So I really wanted to start by mentioning that there have been several comments sort of around how we can ensure, there is additional, what I would call like cultural competency within state agencies, within ensuring that the decisions that are made are not just structurally inclusive, but are really made by folks who most best represent diverse members of the community, BIPOC folks, folks from disproportionately impacted communities and whatnot. And I definitely agree that cultural competency includes things like racial sensitivity training, but I would suggest to the task force to look into things like what active work state agencies can take towards learning anti-racism and really utilizing the tools to stand up against racist attitudes and procedures. In addition to that, I would really hope that the task force might look into opportunities to ensure that state agencies also commit to hiring, retaining, and best investing in, as well as promoting BIPOC staff from these disproportionately impacted communities, and staff who really have the cultural competency to meaningfully change and affect internal systems to better represent Colorado's communities. So following that, my question is, how has the task force considered incorporating workforce diversity, anti-racism, and cultural competency into the recommendations that are potentially coming out of this? The second portion that I have here is really just kind of a statement that I would like to bring to the task force attention, which is that early this week at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Conference, there were several instances demonstrating that many executive leaders within state agencies, in particular the Department of Natural Resources and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, still espouse these deeply racist and harmful views of Black and Brown communities. Given that the Department of Natural Resources and Colorado Parks and Wildlife is highly influential, if not equally influential, in EJ, in environmental justice as CDPHE, I'm curious how the task force is considering partnering with affected community members in order to advocate on really rectifying these inequities and really looking towards some of the mistakes that were made and building a more inclusive future. So thank you. Oh, and I forgot to mention, my name is Jared Bynum. I'm the Communities and Justice Advocate with Conservation Colorado, as well as the Public Policy Co-Chair with the Next 100 Colorado, which is a BIPOC-led, BIPOC-oriented lands conservation volunteer organization. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. Task force members, anybody have any reactions, thoughts, questions?
I just want to say, Jared, thank you for bringing that up. I think the workforce inclusivity is really important. I mean, I will tell you, when I'm at the Capitol, I'm usually the only African-American in these committee rooms at the Capitol. And I think there should be some more emphasis on inclusivity and really intentionality on bringing more people of color into decision-making, particularly on agencies and industry and others, to get perspective and get other thoughts. And so I just want to recognize you and say thank you. I certainly can't speak on behalf of agencies at the state, but I just wanted to just acknowledge and say thank you. And also thank you for your work with Conservation Colorado.
And this is Doug. I just want to say, when I heard the comment, I think what we're doing here with environmental justice is separate and apart from what you're speaking about, although there are certainly quite a bit of overlap. But as far as state departments go, the governor issued an executive order on equity, diversity, and inclusion last year, and all departments, all employees are required to undertake that training that is going through the Department of Personnel Administration. So just to let the commenter know that that's something that is required of all state agencies, and very sorry to hear you had the experience you did.
I would like to, really echo a lot of Michael's comments. I do really appreciate it, Jared, bringing up the comments. Diversifying the workforce, I think, is critical. Labor unions should be designed to provide opportunity to all peoples from all walks of life and everybody here in Colorado. And I think, we've seen tremendous improvements. We formed a Women in the Trades Committee here, as well as various other activities utilizing our existing membership to ensure that we're recruiting better folks. one, it's the right thing to do to make sure folks are getting opportunities for good careers. And two, we want the best workers out there. And if you're not making the effort to recruit for all demographics, I think you're doing a disservice to your membership because there's talent out there that deserves an opportunity to be successful.
Go ahead, Ian.
Hey, Jared, Ian Tafoya here. Just want to say thank you. I actually was present at the Parks and Wildlife Conference when this happened. It was incredibly disturbing for many people there, hundreds of people writing letters, and all sorts of stuff is happening as a background. So I know that it really bothered you, Jared. It bothered me. I don't think it was good for anybody to see. And then I participated in the Department of Natural Resources Equity Roundtable, which happened to take place there in person immediately following. And I just think, because this applies to a different agency, one that was voiced by community members there was when they were talking about accountability just in HR and what happens when problems arise. One in particular from the air modeling division with Gary Kaufman came up from many community members concerned that despite whistleblowers and investigations, he continues to work in the agency in a different capacity. And I just want to share, it's struggled. It was a real struggle for the many people. Many of them were emotional in that meeting. To see HR practices within the government that tend to shift people around rather than real accountability. And I just want to share that came up a bunch.
Go ahead, Ilda.
Yeah, something that I would like to elevate, I think DI trainings are fantastic. And for some individuals that have a small of a gap, but even for some individuals that it teaches them actually how to hide better, there's racist practice in the outward communication. So I would say that one uniform DEI training, it's not the ideal mechanism for us to understand and really hold offices and hold agencies accountable when it comes to this regard. It is one step and a minimal at best to be able to address inequities and racism within these spaces. Actually, sometimes it teaches people just to be better at hiding it.
Thanks all for those additional perspectives and elaborations. I do want to move on to our next commenter, JD Roybal. If you would like to come off mute.
I'll tell you what, it was kind of hard just to sit there sometimes through this, so hang with me when I get a little bit frustrated. I'd like to make a comment, we're talking about the idea of employment or whatever term you want to use. I made a comment a little bit ago when I said 9 out of 10 people will say X. And what I was referring to is if you have one employee working for the industry, and I'm saying about any industry that's actually extractive or some that's actually that's detrimental to public health and safety, that individual convinces only his children, including his grandmother, that his life is actually, all their lives are in danger and jeopardy. Not understanding, not really caring that the rest of the entire world is actually in jeopardy as well. So I want that to be clear, that the CDPHE has to actually consider this, because we have to combat a mindset that has actually been trained to the employee to actually have this kind of a thought pattern and to inflict it upon everybody within his familia, which is, todo eso es muy importante. This is important that we understand this, because this is where you start that division. And I think that's where this task force is going to have to combat that as well, because it's just about jobs. It's the quality of jobs, and it has to do with what their corporation is actually dictating to them and controlling the narrative. They say, follow this rules, and this is what they're going to do. And that's what they're afraid of. And think about it. But they're not necessarily, they're concerned about their health and everything else again, but what they're actually fighting is a narrative that the extractive industry or these big monopoly and oligopolies are actually controlling. Now saying that, I'd like everybody take a deep breath because the whole conversation this morning, it went a completely different than what I think we're not paying attention to. One of the words that in there, and I think that's what we need to focus on, it says provide trust. You know, our governing bodies have actually said, and they've demonstrated throughout the years and years and years, that the people don't matter. And it really is one side. So this group here, where your hands are going to be full and your arms y todo, because we're going to have to provide trust. All the rest that you guys are talking about today, todo es nada, because what you have to do is provide the trust. And the thing that came to mind when I was thinking about this was remember when there was a protest and this black woman was being beat up, and this guy with the red beard, he comes up behind her and he says, "I got you," and she knew she was safe. You guys have to be that white man that comes up to the community, because we don't need saving, but what we do need is protection. And this is where it's important, because it seems like everybody here was getting lost in all the, oh, what about this? What about that? And that's what happens when we get all these people in there that have all these alphabets behind their name. You know, like Lucy says, on the stomach deal, where's my mom? Where's my aunt? You know, this is what happens is when we get these people that are actually disconnected from what's really happening. You're making it too complicated. We have to be the group that actually instills trust. You have to provide trust. You know, and then and Christy, I apologize for this, but when you said you've seen the different sides, we gotta stop seeing different sides. Do you really believe that the KKK, remember the KKK, they're stakeholders from then? You know, we keep saying, oh, they're stakeholders, stockholders, whatever you want to say. But I tell you what, they ain't gonna be sitting down on my table when I'm trying to free my family. There's no place in this group for any corporations to be here. You know, none of us, the entire world, we don't need to understand, you know, the motion or the science of motion when we realize we need a seatbelt in the car, otherwise we go to the windshield. It took years and years and years for us to do this. So you guys, I'm telling you, it's complicated. Let's start from square one. This approach, because of financing, you actually have to go to the people, and I'm telling you the people, and say, listen, we're trying to protect you, but your representatives aren't supporting us, because they're not. Just the latest thing when they sit there and say, oh no, we can't do anything with the trucks. What do you mean you can't do it? The pollution's already here today. People are already dying. Houses are burning. That's where my family lives, is down there where the fires were started, down south. You know, this is already here, friends. We're already here. We're fighting this right now. I didn't mean to go off, but it was kind of hard for me to do this. We've got to really concentrate. Don't get distracted. Si lo puedo. I mean, yes, we can. And that's why I keep hanging with this group. Because even when I was sitting there and we're talking about the forever chemicals in the Capitol, it was so frustrating because the same words are going around that I remember the words that were spoken when we're talking about asbestos and DDT. Nothing's changing. So we've got to be that person that engulfs the communities, and we have to provide trust and hang on that. And all the rest is todo es nada. Because until we establish who we are and we maintain trust, and we're actually who, when it says protection, that's exactly what this group is. And so, and even when everybody says, oh, it's not my department. Yes, it is. When somebody steps out of hand, like even that there was one of the guys that actually made a comment about oh, headaches aren't nothing. The noise, it's like, yes, it is. It can affect you physically. So anyway, I apologize for this, but this has been building because I've been seeing the same thing going over and over and over. And mi familia, I want us to do this. I'm telling you, I'm looking outside and the dust is just blowing all over. We're losing topsoil and everything. This isn't funny, man. This is it. This is our last moment. And remember, I say this from my heart, todo mi corazón, because this comes from a place in my soul. I'm not lying. So I just want to say, I'm not, yeah, just Si lo puedo. Anda.
So this is Christy. I had my hand raised, and I just wanted to clarify, JD, that I was saying, not that I was saying that I see it from three different perspectives. I was saying that I could see that there were three different perspectives on the task force. And I believe industry has to do better. I don't even believe they have they deserve a seat at the table on this task force. I think that they need to be present to listen to the community and how they're impacting us, because right now I feel like we're being held hostage, especially by the energy industry as it stands. So I just wanted to clarify that and let you know that that's what I was actually saying. So thanks.
Again, Christy, I apologize. No.
Not a problem.
No, let me apologize. Because what I was trying to get at is, because you have ideas in your mind. And then when you mentioned that, it brought me to this other thing. No, it wasn't against you. I'm not lying. This isn't against you. What I was simply meaning, I was simply saying, oh, when you mentioned that, I thought, oh yeah, that's right. We're not going to have the Ku Klux Klan. You know what I mean? No. I meant it as a compliment. I'm sorry it sounded negative, because that's not what I meant. Toda es familia aquí, and I want you to understand that. I really believe we're all family. We're trying to do this, and we're trying to do it right. And it's going to have those divisions, but we have to clarify them. Yeah, no, Christy, my friend, I didn't mean it like that. I apologize to you. I really do. Thank you for bringing that up, because I apologize. I didn't mean no harm at all.
Oh, no need to apologize. I just wanted to clarify to everyone else so that they understood what I was trying to say when I interjected at the end of the task force meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you, JD. Any task force members want to comment or share anything in reaction? I know there's been a lot of comments in the chat, so I know a lot of folks have been participating that way while people are providing comments. I do want to give, I think Kelly Crandall wanted to ask a question or maybe provide a comment. Kelly, did you want to come off mute quickly?
Yes, thank you, everyone. And I hate to follow all the meaningful things that have been said with more of a logistical question. So I'm Kelly Crandall. I'm one of the advisors to the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. And I think you've heard us in some of the subcommittee meetings present on some of the process the commission is thinking about doing for how to move forward with creating equity rules under Senate Bill 272. And, honestly, trying to undertake some work that I think might in some places help us be more specific and participate more robustly here. But so what I wanted to raise is, now looking through the recommendations document draft that was sent out, I'm curious if you could share anything more about kind of what you think the next couple of months will look like for the task force leading up to the June meeting, and what kind of public engagement that might look like and things like that. I think as we work on our processes, we're trying to be sensitive to things that other state agencies are doing, while also trying to figure out how to move forward with our legislative requirements.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So a couple things in terms of timeline. We will continue to have our subcommittee meetings between now and June. And there is public comment at most of those subcommittee meetings. Usually the last half hour or so is dedicated to public comment. So there'll be continued ways for the public to engage that way. Our next meeting is on July 21st. And just a quick side note, please keep in mind that I will be meeting with Tyson and Ian in the coming weeks to kind of talk about the planning regarding that meeting. And we are, considering an in-person meeting with, of course, the option to attend virtually. So this hybrid model that we've been talking about, but please do keep that in mind, is that meeting will have the option, likely, depending on how COVID numbers look, to be in person. So that said, Kelly, that'll be the next time that we meet fully as a task force. But between now and then, you can expect the typical subcommittee meetings happening. 5 different subcommittees. We meet every month. And so the subcommittee meetings are happening on average once a week, or sometimes there's 2 in 1 week. I can continue to, as I suggested earlier, I can send the calendar invitations of all the subcommittee meetings to all the task force members, and you can accept or reject those calendar invitations. And Kelly, you and I can talk about this offline, but if it's helpful for you, I can include you on those just so you have a sense of the schedule. I do, and does that answer your question, Kelly?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I do want to, well, before we wrap up, I have a couple comments to make before 3 o'clock, but I wanted to see if folks had any kind of final thoughts or comments before we wrap up and sign off.
Hey, Lubna, this is Ian. Your comment just now made me wonder if there is the Google Calendar online set up in a way where people can like subscribe to it and layer it into their calendars, like for anybody out there? Because I subscribe to some calendars like that let me know when different commissions and things are.
Yes, I believe so. And Morgan and Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can, we can have people subscribe to the EJ unit activities calendar. Is that right? Maybe, or like we can send them the calendar invitation to add to their, is that possible or no?
I'm not actually sure if we have a feature that allows people to subscribe and automatically get updates. I'm sorry, I'm just not sure off the top of my head if that's possible, but certainly we do, have all of the task force meetings and many other meetings on our public calendar on our website. And it is a great place to look to kind of be informed about what's going on, but I'm not specifically aware of a subscribe feature that exists. Sorry, off the top of my head.
Maybe I'm explaining it wrong. I'm working on a ballot initiative that has the same thing available on our website right now, where we have like a calendar in there and you can just like click in the corner because it's a public calendar and you can like add it to your calendar. And so if we can do that for a ballot initiative using a Google thing, I think we should be able to do it too.
And Ian, I think there was just a comment in the chat from Jared who might have cracked this question. And I see, okay, Joel is hovering his mouse over the screen share of like the Google Calendar, and it looks like you can do it there. So if you go to the EJ unit website, the bottom right part of the calendar, it looks like you can click on the bottom right, and then the calendar could get integrated into your personal Google Calendar. And if that doesn't work for you, Ian, I'm happy to talk about.
No, that works for me. I was saying that for the public or anybody else who wanted to add it into their calendar instead of having to go back to the website.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I actually did not know you could do that, so it's great to know. I do want to just make a quick comment regarding Jared Bynum's public comment that was provided, raising issues with just kind of just discriminatory language and issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I do want to mention that as your EJ unit staff, although this does not tie directly into task force recommendations, we will be kind of sharing that comment and some of the conversation that was had here with Jalen Coates. Jalen Coates is a new equity, diversity, and inclusion director at CDPHE. And, we would love to kind of talk a little bit more about that happening, the issues that were brought up, and more to come on that. So I just wanted to mention that. All right, I know that we are past 3 o'clock. We're at 3:03. Please do keep in mind we have another full task force meeting coming up on July 21st. The exact timing and location subject to change, with still the option to attend via Zoom. But thank you all so much for your undivided attention for the past 2 days, Tuesday and today. Much appreciated. I hope everybody can go out and enjoy the rest of their weekend and spend, sorry, June 21st. I apologize if I said July, it isn't June. Yes, thank you so much again for members of the public and for task force members. If there are any recommendations or further elaboration on what was presented today in terms of kind of this draft report, please do submit those to us via public comment. Thanks a lot. We'll be in touch.
Thanks. Thank you all.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank
And
you.
thank
everybody.
you.